This week on Breaking the Ice, we're launching our new podcast series around the Arctic. Hosts Nauja Bianco, Criag Fleener, Jessica Shadian, and I, Jaiden Stevens, are going to bring to you what we do best by taking our cross-border conversations from Alaska, Canada, and Greenland from the coffee shop and happy hour to the podcast space. Each week, we will discuss, argue, contemplate, and share news, politics, and stories of the week from in and around the Arctic. So, grab your coffee and join us where Talking Arctic comes to life.
Okay. We're off. Okay, hi guys.
Hello.
So it's our first go at this. Conversations around the Arctic. And yeah. First of all, I don't know, where is everybody right now? I'm in Toronto. Sunny out, but cold, so I feel like it's finally fall.
What is cold?
Oh, not very cold.
Okay.
Well, it started at 0 this morning.
Oh,
So
that's
not hot.
that's almost cold.
Right? It's on the cusp of getting towards cold, yeah.
So I'm in Anchorage, and it's not really that cold here yet. We're right around 0 as well, just a little below, or 25 Fahrenheit for us Fahrenheit users. I'm not on the Yukon River, which is right behind me in this picture, but it would be nice to be there. But I'm in
Wait, but you're 0 Celsius almost. Is that what you're saying?
Below or is it 0 Celsius? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Now, where are you? Yeah.
And here it's about 6 degrees Celsius. Not cold, but you can tell that the sort of crispy fall weather is approaching us. But I was in Tromsø, northern Norway last week, and got the first snow there. So
nice.
I've had a little of everything this week.
Okay.
Yeah, we just got our first snow that stuck of the year this past week as well. About probably a little over a foot, maybe 14 inches. So
that's a lot, actually.
There was a lot of shoveling the last couple of days.
Yeah. Jaiden, what's it like where you are?
Yeah, I'm in Norman Wells, Northwest Territories. It's warming up now. This morning it was around -15. Now it's around -9 Celsius. And yeah.
Okay, I think that's fair. Is that fair enough to say? That's kind of winter approaching.
I see with the three of you, I'm going to have to keep a conversion chart nearby.
Right, and if we start talking about cooking or something, we're really going to have to get out the conversion charts. So I'm so glad so I'm really glad to have all of you here, because this is something I personally wanted to do for a long time. And I think that we need some more of these type of discussions in the Arctic. We've been talking, Criag and I've known you guys for like close to 20 years, and how many hours have been spent arguing, talking, just Arctic politics. And I think exactly. And sometimes they get heated, sometimes they're totally in agreement. Usually we're always excited because we are very passionate about what we think about things. But I think these are on the conversations that are missing from just, people, just civil society at large. And I think most Canadians don't have a chance to listen to free flow discussions on Arctic politics. One
of the things that's really interesting to me, Jessica, is how, at least my impression is, how afraid people are to say what they really think is real and from their perspectives, because so many people, when you're going to conferences or you're at some sort of a meeting or an event, there's the sort of the mandatory set of responses, right? And you wonder what's really on people's minds. And I think that has been a hallmark of our discussions is, yes, we know what our national perspectives are. We know what our the other perspectives are, but we're also willing and able to talk about things even outside of our own comfort zones, right? You'll present something to me and I might say, well, that's crazy. Yeah, let's talk about it. And I definitely present crazy ideas to you all the time. And you're like, yeah, let's talk about it. And I think that's really valuable. And we don't do enough of that at all.
Totally. I couldn't agree more.
And, I agree. Seen from a Greenlandic point of view, I think it's just really important that we're courageous about talking about things that we're not necessarily super familiar with. And just the whole cross-border, all the cross-border questions that we need to address that, they're all important to the North American Arctic, but they might be different from one another. There might be different angles to the same, let's say, climate change. Just that question, there might be different angles to whether you ask an Alaskan or a Northern Canadian or a Greenlander.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm curious. And one thing I'll just say, and then I really want to know what it's like up in Norman Wells, Jaiden. But one thing I think also is nice is like all three of us have kind of worked all around the Arctic. And so we're always in and out of all these spaces. And so it kind of gives you, for me personally, where I've lived and worked, has given me whole different angles on my understandings of those places, but also the whole region at large and how people perceive them. And so it makes it much more messy, but also more nuanced, and I think adds a lot to these kind of conversations. So in that way, yeah.
What I find is important with conversations like these that we're sort of trying to facilitate here with this podcast is that, we need to get out there. I've been lucky to work with the Arctic for about 20 years now, and I'm just super privileged to actually come from the Arctic. So I know of the Arctic by heart, in this case, specifically Greenland. But I also think there's a tendency that we see a tendency that matters related to the Arctic is very esoteric. So when, the three of us, when we go to conferences, we know what people are talking about, but we can't take it for granted that people outside that sort of Arctic conference world knows what's being talked about. And I think a podcast like this, is supposed to get out there.
Yeah.
Totally. Yep.
So Nauja, you said something I think it would be important for everybody to understand, and that is where you're from. So why don't you tell us where you're born and raised and where you are from, and then maybe we can all do that. Give folks some context.
Great idea. So my name is Nauja Bianco, and I am an Inuk from Greenland. I am actually a big city girl. I come from the capital of Nuuk with today about 18,000 people. So yeah, that's me. And, Greenland has a population of about 57,000 people in total. So that's where I'm from. I was born and raised in Nuuk, but my father is from Eastern Greenland, which is a quite remote place of Greenland.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. And I think, well, I'll skip that for now. But yeah, so I'm born and raised in Alaska as well. I'm in from Fort Yukon, Alaska, 8 miles above the Arctic Circle. And I'm not on the world's largest island like you are, but Alaska is sort of considered by many to be an island because we're so greatly disconnected from the rest of the US. And I would say disconnected in a lot of regards, whether it's cultural or infrastructure, just sometimes people even ask the craziest questions like, what kind of money do you use up there and what language do you speak? So I've also been working on Arctic issues probably even longer. I being born and raised above the Arctic Circle, I got a passion for working with wildlife a long time ago. And I'm actually a moose biologist. You see those moose antlers right there? So that was one of my areas of focus for a long time. I've done healthcare, education, and natural resources management all the way back probably starting in the early 90s. Before then, I was in the United States Marine Corps in the 80s, so I didn't get a chance to do much Arctic-y stuff in the Marines, but spent a lot of time working on looking at the changing climate. And the more interesting thing about the climate research I did was less about the fact that the climate is changing, but more focused on what the impacts are to wildlife and then what the subsequent impacts are to humans. So sort of a really big ball of wildlife, human climate adaptations and interactions and what's happening and how we're going to make it through. And so I got a lot of interest in working on Arctic issues there and spent about 10 years as a permanent participant to the Arctic Council and got to know an awful lot of folks across the Arctic, spending a lot of time in all of the Arctic countries. And so that's a brief bit about me.
I like it. Jaiden, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm Jaiden Stevens. I'm from Northern Wales, Northwest Territories. That's I live in a very remote community up in the Northwest Territories, so there's no roads to get in or out. It's fly-in only community, so very remote. Um, yeah.
There we go.
Fort Yukon's remote as well. No roads, no rail, just like you guys.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Jessica Shadian. I grew up in San Diego, California, in the United States, so you can see clearly why I'm sitting here today in this space. I guess it's been a bit of a, I had my own tour de force around the world to end up in this chair. But I got into Arctic issues back in the beginning of 2000s when I started my PhD. I was in global politics, and at that time, everyone was trying to understand different ideas about sovereignty, and how, I guess sovereignty all over the place and how it was going up and down, above states, below states. And I ended up at a conference, listened to a discussion that I found like quite interesting, talking about Greenland should secede and become a microstate, and how, like, using like Ireland and these other things as examples. And I remember thinking, well, then what happens? Are you going to be more free or less free in terms of having sovereignty over yourself when you're a small state in a big world? And that kind of led towards stumbling upon the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and was fascinated because it got me going into the archives. And I was really enamored with Eben Hobson and kind of those discussions that were taking place in the early 70s. I think he was a huge trailblazer, and I thought he was a fantastic politician in the sense that his efforts and then what became the ICC was a way to talk about and take over a narrative. And so they integrated the discourse about a nation of people who live across these different countries within the international system by using and actually changing international law, and a lot of international human rights law and indigenous rights, and so I just was always quite impressed with the savviness of the way that that Eben Hobson and then Inuit Circumpolar Council was able to kind of articulate its place and its role in the world. And and it just, so it started there, but it then led me to basically a couple of years later waking up one morning in Rovaniemi, Finland, with the snow so high I couldn't see out my window, and I was like, oh, okay, welcome to the north. And I actually remember I went to a UN meeting to go talk and introduce myself to some folks from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and they're just like, who the hell are you? Like, this white girl from, like, California, whatever, gonna you want to write about us? Like, we already could talk about ourselves and write about us. I'm like, no. Like, I'm not an anthropologist, because at that time, nobody was talking about Arctic politics in terms of the global politics. I'm like, no, I leave that to you. I'm trying to look at how the ICC is like interacting in this world, this changing world of changing global politics. And so it took a long time to kind of make friends, and I learned a lot. But that's early on those days. That's when we met, and I ended up working in northern Norway for quite some time, and then spent time in Iceland and all of this. So I've just been all over the place, and so definitely come squarely from outside, being not from the Arctic and not indigenous, but this is just where I'm at. And I don't know, these Arctic conferences are some of my best times, because I have some of my long-standing closest friends that I see over and over again every year, and I love it. So wouldn't take it away for nothing. So
Makes it awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, one of the coolest things that I think I've come to understand or believe and really push for through participating in all those Arctic events that you're talking about is the greater need. And I don't think we do this really at all. I would like to say we don't do it much, but I don't think we do it at all. And that is East-West collaboration. Most of the time when I or other people say East-West collaboration, that people are thinking,
Cold War,
Western civilization and Eastern civilization. And that's not what I mean. What I mean is in the North American context, at least, if we ignore our national governments for a minute and just think of us as either indigenous peoples or northern peoples, the value and the need for us to collaborate more, because the interesting thing is Alaska is less than an inch away from Yukon territory. We're really close. They're our neighbors, but we don't talk to them.
Yeah.
We don't work with them. I have cousins right across the border, right? And they're Canadians. I'm an American. Why aren't we working together to where we sort of go back in time and look at each other as cousins, friends, neighbors, and work on our issues together? Because and the same thing goes all the way across. And the unique relationship, especially with Inuit or Inupiat or whichever, however they designate themselves in their own countries, their relationships across almost the entire Arctic is indicative of what I think we should have for the territories, the state, the provinces, whatever, across the Arctic, working together, looking at our problems together, because what's happening in Greenland is a very similar problem set to what we're doing in Alaska. It's very similar to NWT, Yukon, Nunavut. They're really the same problems with very similar minded people, all from the northern parts of the world, and who have lived in and understand the struggle, but we're not working together enough. So I think the thing that I've learned along the way is we need to do more, and we need to spend more time talking about solving the problems from our own perspectives. Now, the tough part, of course, is we don't print our own money, right? The national governments print the money, and so they get to dictate policy. But I still think that there's real value in us coming together as northern people to look at our problems together, and that's one of the things that I hope we can push in this podcast.
Maybe we should make an Arctic Bitcoin.
I was just thinking something like, I was just saying, well, isn't there like
that's a cool idea.
Digital currencies these days? Anyone could be doing that, right?
Moly,
So
I like that.
there we go. Okay. Note to self.
Craig, I think you're touching upon a very pertinent but also sensitive issue. And that's why we came together today to speak to one another, because we really want to bridge those national boundaries, if at all possible, right? Because you're pointing to the fact that, even though, let's say, Inuit are the same people, they're brothers, sisters, cousins, the same goes for the Sami. They're also, a cross-border people, but we're still very much defined by our national state, and ultimately who we were colonized by. So it's hard for us sort of to think beyond those borders, even though I do really think that there's a great wish for doing so. Let me just give you an example. The Greenlandic government issued its actually first foreign and defense policy of February this year. And in that policy, you also see a wish to do this cross-border, cross-boundary cooperation. So there's a big wish from the Greenlandic side to actually work together with cousins and partners in Canada and in Alaska. And they've suggested to do a North American Arctic Forum. So it hasn't been kickstarted yet, but now the idea is actually put into paper in the Greenlandic foreign and defense strategy. So let's see if it can take us just a tiny step towards that.
Actually, I like that, and that's something we should come back on another episode and pick up on, because there's so many questions and thoughts I have on that one. I think, though, also when we're talking about these building these connections across borders, that it also shouldn't be perceived, though, as I feel like sometimes maybe it's sensitive in some places, because Greenland is in a different space in terms of working with Denmark for and towards real self-determined sovereignty as a nation, where identity and citizenship and everything, like in the Canadian North, for instance, is much different. It's different in the sense that I think it was that, the famous quote, and I don't want to misquote the person and the person who quoted it, but talking about how, in terms of Inuit, we may be, first Canadians, but we are also Canadians first, and that kind of thing. And so this relationship between being able to realize your own identity, but also that you are, firmly rooted in the state that now that you're part of. And so I think sometimes I wonder if people get nervous to let too many people across these borders talk to one another because what might be going on, like, and what they might be thinking. And so I think it's just, we've got those differences and everything as well, but that doesn't mean we're all the same.
That might be ripe for another discussion. And one of the things that I've talked with friends of mine about in the past, because I've sort of lived in that place of controversy, whether it's dealing with hunting and fishing issues in Alaska and the differences between indigenous hunting rights or issues and states' rights and federal rights.
Yeah.
And I've been pushed against the wall to sort of explain myself on who I am and what my beliefs are, not just by the folks that support the federal oversight, not just by folks that support state oversight, but even folks on the tribal side. And what I've come to describe to people is sort of my three-spirited nature, where I think it's okay, and I don't have a problem being proud to be an American. I've been in uniform. I've served my country. I went to combat. Nobody can say that I've not done my part serving my country. Giving back to my country, and I want to continue to give back. And the same thing goes for the state of Alaska and what I've contributed to the state, what I've gotten from the state, and to my tribe. The way I describe my sort of faithfulness to each of those things without having to be ashamed of any of them is that, and I'm usually explaining this to non-native folks, but I tell people that I'm proud to be an American for the very same reasons I just described. I say that the same thing about my work in Alaska. I've served in political office. I've served in state government. I've served in the Alaska National Guard. Many years of commitment to the state. So I'm very proud to be an Alaskan, very proud to be an American. And but the amazing thing about both of those is Alaska's only been a state since the 50s, practically the 1960s. So we haven't been a state for very long, which means we might not be a state forever. The United States is a very young country, and it may not be a country forever. But what I tell people is God made me Gwich'in, and you can't take that away. It's what is in my genetics. It's in my DNA. So I will be that forever, no matter who is president or king or dictator of this big patch of land. So I think we can be all three of those things. And I think that's actually an area for discussion where we can talk about these cross-border big national issues, but also do it from the little hometown boy perspective, because that's the perspective I bring.
I want to go over to Jaiden quickly. I've had, just put this on a personal note. So I've had a lot of conversations with Inuit homos and from Greenland, and I wonder if I'm always inspired or intrigued by these discussions because just myself being Jewish, and so growing up, and it just kind of makes you have, you're rooted, you're not rooted, you're in, you're out. It depends on what's going on, and so these kind of like questions about identity being kind of part of my life growing up. And even when I was young, I didn't realize it until there's always something different about me, but I didn't know what really kind of. And then so kind of maybe more as an adult, you kind of start realizing how these things impact you and affect you, and how you, this constant quest to navigate and figure out, who I am. So Jaiden, you're really interesting as well. First of all, because of all these conversations, I want to know, what's it like? What do people, how do people talk and conversate about maybe like what's going on right there in Norman Wells, but also its connection to kind of, like Canada and also larger Arctic politics and these kind of things. And also from your own perspective, because I think you are not from, you are First Nation, but you're not from Norman Wells yourself, right? So not from the Satu region. And so how does that play into your own self and place and identity and perspective, I guess?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Originally my family is Cree from Manitoba, so from down south, but since before I remember, I've been raised in the Satu region in the Northwest Territories, so I really do feel like a northerner. But
we accept you.
But yeah, it's kind of interesting listening to the perspectives, even just in my hometown, revolving like climate change and like more national policies, because a big part of the conversation in the North right now is also about self-government and kind of how we're going to be self-determined in our communities. So it's a bit complicated when you're trying to think about these national policies that affect us, but also coming up with our own policies and partners to figure out things for the North.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
really interesting thing you bring up there, because one of the complexities in the US when we talk about self-determination is one of the sides of the political spectrum on the conservative or the Republican, or there's a broad number of political titles, but they really support the concept of self-determination. But the sort of the national political movement feels like they support self-determination down to the lowest level possible, unless you're a tribe, right? If you're a tribe or a First Nation, then it's like, you need to fill in with the rest of us. So I like the idea of that discussion, and that is an area that needs more attention, is how do we get this part of the national, and I'm not sure if it's the same in Canada, I think that there are some similarities, but how do we get this national dialogue to continue to support self-determination all the way down to the lowest level? Because I think that from the US perspective, that's a very US constitutional perspective, right? Self-determination, individual civil liberties, government leave us alone, let us run our own lives, let us do our own thing. And then you marry that to the individual tribal existence, and that's what they want as well. But it doesn't come out that way in the public discourse.
Much more messy and complicated.
If I can just sort of go back to Craig, what you were saying about identity, I actually think we should do a session just on identity.
I do.
Identities in the Arctic, because it's so complex, and it's also filled with a lot of emotion.
Yeah.
And the reason why I want to get back to what you said, Craig, in terms of being this or that, or maybe like a third thing, is that I get very touched, actually, when you say out loud that you're proud to be an American, you're proud to be an Alaskan, but you're also proud to be Indigenous. And at least in a Greenlandic context, where there's been nation building quite heavily since 1979, when Greenland got its Home Rule Act, there's been discussions about, identity in one shape or the other, but it all revolved around who was the right Inuk, who was the right Greenlander, because it was so important as part of distinguishing yourself from a colonialism that you had to point out if, quote unquote, the right Greenlander or the right Inuk. And I think that left people actually afraid of talking about identity in a profound level. So that's why I get touched when I hear you say what you say, and just think there's a lot to be said when it comes to identity in the Arctic.
Yeah, that's a powerful thing you just said, and actually I'm feeling it all over. And I think Alaska went through this very same thing, right? And at our statehood in the 1950s, some of the profound things that happened were no Native person could really vote in determining whether or not we were going to be a state. We were actually, some could. If you had 3 non-Native people that would vouch for you that you were civilized and that you had turned your back on your indigenous culture, then you were allowed to participate. But other than that, you weren't allowed to vote. And we were the majority population, or really close to it. There wasn't really a good count of people back then, but we were the majority population, and we probably would have had a pretty big impact on the statehood vote. I'm not saying we wouldn't have voted to become a state, but I think the outcome would have been different. There were so many military people. Alaska was just a military outpost after World War II, and continues to really be a military stronghold, that a lot of military folks were prominent in the vote. And they're transitory, right? They're not going to be here for very long. So the idea that you rely on folks who are only going to be here for a year or two to determine the future of a territory, it seems kind of bizarre. And the even more sad reality is not only did Alaska Natives not participate at any appreciable level in determining whether or not we're going to be a state, we had no say or very little say on what the Constitution of the state would say. And so the future of governance of Alaska was also dictated by those similar people and lower 48ers that came up to help write the Constitution. So Alaska Natives had practically no say in what the state was going to be, how it was going to look. So I think I have a very similar, I didn't live through it. You are living through it, but I think I have a similar sort of collective memory of what you're going through now, and the identity thing is a really important topic. So yes, I like the idea of us having a show on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm getting really into it. So what we want to, I think it's okay if we move on to a bit of the topical piece. So it's Sunday afternoon where I am. I am dual citizen, American and Canadian. And
So do you have your absentee ballot?
So voted. It's, I guess I was reading something that you said, oh, every time there's a new US election, it's like the biggest election ever. But let's just say
most important election of your life.
Yeah, exactly. So but I think regardless if it's the most or not the most, it's still a very important one. And so I think it's good for us to have a conversation a bit on what we think its impacts might be, just for Arctic cooperation, and for the Arctic at large. And I thought then, thank you, Nauja, you passed over a really interesting article for us, because I think there's something we could chew on, I think, to kind of get at Tuesday's elections. Do you want to talk about this article quickly, and then we can kind of get into it?
Thanks, Jessica. So yeah, we're talking about it's November 3rd today, and in 2 days, we'll have the election, the presidential election in the U.S., and everybody's just looking at it with a lot of curiosity, a lot of excitement, especially also from Greenland, but also from where I live currently in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I happened to stumble upon an article from the journal called National Interest, a U.S. journal. And the article is called "It's Time for a U.S. Greenland Free Association Agreement." It's written by, let me just quickly double check. Well, for example, a former deputy assistant to the president, chief of staff of the White House, and also connected to the National Security Council, and a couple of other folks. So it's really people who've written this article or who've done this analysis are people that have been close to decision-making bodies, important decision-making bodies in the U.S., right? Obviously, that's interesting in itself. And it's written or it's published on October 22nd. So basically what it says, this is really interesting because Greenland, even though Greenland has extensive self-autonomy with the Greenland Self-Rule Act, Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, along with the Faroe Islands. And has been connected to Denmark since 1721. But this article really points out, one, there is an interest for the Arctic in the US, and that interest will remain after the election on Tuesday. Second, this whole idea of a free association is really interesting, because what it really does is that it sort of it spurs into, or it sort of it sort of stresses the notion of independence of Greenland. So there is a wish of independence in Greenland. But the thing is, and it sort of goes back to what you said, motivating you for going into Arctic studies, Jessica, right? You were talking about, well, Greenland's talking about independence, but will they, when they get their independence, let's say they do, or we do, will they then become more or less independent, and by whom, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this article actually points to the notion that the US should make a so-called free association status with Greenland, which would sort of make it make Greenland an independent state, also, or independent entity, also with sovereignty over foreign and security policy, which is not the case today. But it would still make Greenland dependent on various structures, in this case with the US. That would be defense and military, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The interesting thing is that it hasn't been stressed it hasn't been articulated this strongly before.
Yeah. So before you go to the second part, I mean, I was looking at it and I just thought things that it was pointing out is, opportunity for residents to reside and work in the U.S., eligible for federal programs and services, because I think that's according to this kind of legal structure they're talking about. Economic trust fund, sectoral assistance, educational. To me, it sounds like, what's the difference then, right? And having a relationship with Denmark, and then and then we change, and then you guys are looking more towards North American Arctic, but then how does that? But this kind of almost transfers that same kind of a lot of the relationships between Denmark and Greenland to then become Greenland, US. And of course, and then that's a whole host of questions because there's Canada in between the two, and this, that, and the other thing. But maybe talk about the second part that they were looking at, and maybe that gets into my last point.
Well, if I may just comment on what you were saying, and that sort of also goes back to some of the things Craig was mentioning earlier, that while Americans predominantly, whether or not they actually vote Democratic or Republican, there's sort of distance to government interference, right? Whereas the Nordic welfare states, which have shaped the welfare state of Greenland, there's much more state involvement, or much more public involvement. So I think whereas it might look tempting for a Greenlander, or for Greenland as such, to become part of the US sort of within a free association agreement, I think it would be a huge shock. Because there's simply a tradition built now when it comes to sort of state buildup, and an expectancy of the state playing a huge role. So I think that in itself, let's say we were to have a free association with the US, I think that would be the first huge shock Greenland would get.
And is it in the interest of Greenland to kind of then run off and right away align itself with something else in such a strong way? I almost feel like, I don't know, maybe being strategic, you're kind of it's not a non-aligned, but you get to work with this place, this entity or this collaboration of countries where it suits Greenland's purpose, and and then do other relationships with other countries that suits Greenland's purpose for other reasons. And then there's kind of comes back to traditional Arctic Council and these kind of things. And
so obviously there's a decolonial tendency in Greenland, and there is a wish for creating more to the way Denmark have ruled over a lot of decisions in Greenland. But having said that, we've had a history with Denmark since 1721, and it's not only about history and politics and government or even funds going back and forth. It's also about people and mixed marriages and personal relations that have been built and nurtured and strengthened throughout time. I myself is part of a Danish Greenlandic marriage, child of a Danish Greenlandic marriage. So for me, being in this type of relation is not too bad. I'm not saying that there are no problems when it comes to the relationship between Denmark and Greenland, but for me, it's actually not too bad. But let me get back to there's a former diplomat in the Danish Foreign Service. He just retired, I think, a year ago. And he used to be, among other things, the ambassador of NATO for the Kingdom of Denmark. And I just heard him speak at an Arctic festival here in Copenhagen just yesterday, where he is actually pleading for a free association agreement between Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Denmark. So he's one of the few voices in Denmark who actually wants to see a renewal of our relationship, because he acknowledges that this way we're with the Constitution of the Kingdom of Denmark currently, it doesn't include the sort of nation building sentiments of Greenland nor the Faroe Islands. So this is an interesting subject, and we're basically just hoping that politicians of Denmark and Greenland would start talking about it seriously.
Interesting. Then there's the second part of the article.
Before we go on, can I ask a question? Because
Yes.
I've always thought of a free association compact as more of an economic tool. Now, in this specific example, that article, there is discussion of defense, but the way you're describing it makes me think that there's a component of government oversight, and I don't think that is supposed to be part. And when I say government, I mean the bigger government. In this case, it'd be the U.S. Because Jessica's question was, well, what do you gain if you're just switching from Denmark to the U.S.? I don't think it's a one-for-one thing, right? The United States would not be dictating national policy over Greenland. An agreement is primarily to say, let's do business, at least as far as I understand, please tell me if I'm wrong, let's do business together. Yes, let's have a special military relationship together, because clearly, if Alaska is considered one of the most strategic places on Earth, for the exact same reason, Greenland would be considered one of the most strategic places on Earth, because they bookend the North America. And so they would both be equally critical. And the U.S. has lots of relationships with countries around the world for military, right? And of course, they're the largest provider of forces for all of NATO. So I think it would be part of that, but not necessarily in terms of governance. And so tell me what I'm missing.
Yeah, well, the part that kind of threw me off, though, was this thing about, like, you're eligible for federal programs and services. You're creating a very kind of unequal relationship that way, right? So when you have then Greenlanders who are feeding into, and if it's a federal allotment, if it's a federal service, like a federal service that it's providing, it is becoming under this governance structure, because it's beholden to kind of U.S. policy mandate and types.
When you take someone's money,
exactly.
Right?
So it's much more subtle. It's not like, okay, now they're going to colonize, but it's in a more subtle way that you become more dependent rather than maybe interdependent because of the balance of the.
So that's the balancing act: are these dollars worth what the strings are asking for?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think you're right, Craig, that it's really about if there will be a governance monitoring of Greenland that also sort of inflicts on national policies and legislation and interest. That's not really the case today either, because Greenland has autonomy on most national areas, but still, with the history of colonialism, that is still intact, right? I think that's the whole question of, would we ever be able to cut that string and create a new that is more balanced and more equal?
Yeah. Well, and I know in my most recent travels to Greenland, some of the discussions with folks there have been around how Greenland strengthens its ties with Canada and Alaska or the US, probably specifically because of geography and the indigenous identity. Now, the national identity is tied to Europe and Denmark, of course, right? The history, all of that. But there's a really strong interest in sort of revitalizing the indigenous connections across North America and sort of respecting the geographical connections. The fact that Greenland is what, 30, not even 30. What is the distance between Greenland and Canada? It's not far. It's
it's
you could
26 kilometers way north.
there.
26 kilometers.
So really, really close. And so it's understandable to know that the colonial aspect means that it's part of Denmark, just like the colonial aspect of the United States was once part of France, part of Britain, part of Spain, and England, of course, that we fought and changed that. So those things are understandable, but there's a tremendous amount of interest to make those connections over here. So it's logical to me to see that there would be in the discussions about making those ties, it's logical to say we should probably also look at strengthening economic ties, which is what I saw this as. And even
But that's
even one step further, Jessica, I would say one of the things that I've promoted since I started working as a permanent participant to the Arctic Council was the idea that the indigenous people should be working together. And I and several of my friends took the idea with us every time we met with our Greenland friends for the Inuit in Greenland to work with the Inuit and others in Alaska to take a look at our Alaska Native Corporation model and how we have done economic development over here that has been madly successful, especially on the regional level, in some cases on the village level, but certainly on the regional level. And that's just that, to me, that's very similar to this. Is indigenous people from Greenland could have a free association, sort of a compact with indigenous people in Canada and in Alaska, and let's do business together.
And so, and that would be a little bit different. But then this gets into the second part of this article, because it wasn't just talking about this free, the compact free association thing. It was also talking about incorporating Greenland into the UMSCA legislation, or the Canada, US Mexico free trade agreement. And I think that goes maybe though, that can be good, an interesting segue though into the elections coming up, because so first of all, that's an interesting concept. And then because that goes more along the levels of what you were talking about, Craig, in terms of having this kind of trade agreement. Of course, it's not just it's more national than indigenous. But one of the, big discussions about what's happening in the elections is then if there is another Trump administration, then there would be a quick renegotiation of the free trade agreement, the North American, UMSCA, or when you say Canada, I don't know, US Mexico free trade agreement altogether, which I think though maybe can help us also just kind of pivot back into, what are some of the main issues that we think this election could impact, how it could impact, kind of Arctic, more generally speaking, possibly, I think, obviously things like climate change, there's going to be a very different approach to climate change if it's Kamala Harris versus Trump. But what about other issues in terms of joining UNCLOS for the United States, about the Northwest Passage in general, and just even the approach to kind of US approach to the Arctic in terms of the Arctic Council, and let's say even NORAD, NATO. And that's one thing we haven't spoken about either, is kind of Greenland and Greenland's role in let's say even just NORAD itself. Which is not, but is that something?
Let me throw out a couple of thoughts
yeah,
just to get
totally.
the discussion going.
Yep.
I think I think, of course, there's going to be a different perspective on things, and probably with a Donald Trump presidency, there will be more focus on the sovereignty aspect and less on the global aspects. So there'll be emphasis on making sure that the economy is more self-sustaining, right? That part of the issues with globalizing your own national economy is you become dependent on so many things from outside, which a lot of people like. I don't know if I necessarily like that idea, because I'm, as Jaiden and I were talking about earlier, I like the idea of sort of self-sufficiency and self-determination, and being reliant on so many things from the outside makes it tough, especially if you're a place like Yukon, Alaska, Greenland, because we're naturally more dependent on other folks. And I think a model for us to consider in terms of being more self-reliant is the Iceland model. Take a look at what they've done to have less dependency on the outside and more support inside. So I think that's going to be a big difference, which means that there'll be emphasis on economic development in ways that are different. Clearly, the Republican side is less interested in some of the green energy transition stuff. What I would hope is that a Republican administration would do what they used to be really good at, and that is put money into research. Because I think a lot of what we failed at with the concept of the green transition is research to make it work. You know, the big problems we have with solar and wind right now is we don't have battery storage. And if you're going to implement these things in the north, you can't just toss a village a few $1,000,000 and say, go build a wind generator, because the batteries are not good yet. So I would hope that they would return back to not to just completely turn their back on the concept of a changing climate, but look at it in ways to actually advance the cause. And the cause really should be, how do we become more efficient? And I think that is going to be a Republican side of the House focus area. How do we become more efficient so costs and effectiveness go down? Whereas a Kamala Harris side of a Democrat side of the election would be, let's put money into and law and regulation into mandating change. And that is one way of doing things, but it becomes very expensive. And I don't necessarily think that that's the most effective way to do it. Maybe a combination of the two would be more effective, but purely mandating law that says you will use solar and wind when solar and wind they're not capable yet of meeting the needs that we have. So that's one. The real tricky question is national defense, because things have sort of taken an interesting turn. Back when I was a kid, we always talked about how the Republican side of the ticket were the war hawks, and the Democrat side of the House were not the war hawks, were the doves.
Yeah.
And it sort of has taken an interesting twist to now the Democrats are being called the war hawks and the Republicans are being called the doves, which I never thought I would experience in my life. It's certainly that in the rhetoric, right? You hear Trump talking about, oh, well, I never led anybody to war, and I wanted to reduce, and the reverse is the case. And of course, what's going to happen with Ukraine? Does President Trump really have the connection to just make a phone call and say, bring this to an end, or is that all rhetoric? So,
and what does that mean for what that means for the larger Arctic cooperation in and of itself? Yeah,
certainly, because the Arctic nations are really worried about a buildup in Russia and a continued buildup because of the war.
Yeah. From a Canadian perspective, I mean, okay, so Canadians are really there's a lot of thoughts, opinions, anxiety, dread, whatever have you, on all, it's just, living above of the United States means that you spend most of your time talking about the United States. I think from an Arctic perspective, whichever of the two, I think wins and ends up in the presidency, there is a part that will stay the same in that Canada is having a moment where at the end of the day, Canada needs to step up more, and it's starting to, but it needs to really start focusing on its own Arctic. And so whether I feel that it's going to find itself in a real compromised situation, because if Trump gets in and then has, little regard or disregard or for what Canada thinks or what Canada says, or the relationship between Canada and the United States, that's the fact that we haven't been, spending what we need to spend and building the infrastructure that we need to build and putting money into our defense is going to really be problematic. But that's the interesting thing as well, because on the conventional side, you would say, well, we're going to be then run over by the US because, not a lot of people are taking the Canadian position that Northwest Passage is in internal waters. Last time we had Pompeo, talking about, going through with the ship without having to ask.
But it's an interesting one you bring up, Jessica, about the US sort of steamrolling Canada on the defense side. If you take a look at Alaska, it's not that much more well defended than northern Canada. So it's easy to say that of course the US spends massive amounts on defense and wants its partners and allies to do the same. It would be very difficult for the US to point to a time and place where we've spent enough. If we truly think the Arctic is an area of vulnerability, or that's not the right way to say it, the Arctic is an area of vulnerability. If we truly think that the Arctic is a place where conflict is likely to happen, I'm not one that thinks that is very logical. No one in their right mind wants to or is going to get much of a strategic advantage by having conflict at -40. And there's no infrastructure, there's no roads. If some invading force lands in Alaska, in northern Alaska, western Alaska, northern Canada, okay, then what? There's 900 people that live within 200 miles. What are you going to do now? And there's no roads to get from here to there.
Yeah.
And the summer conditions are worse. They're warmer, but being able to traverse the landscape is nearly impossible. Jaiden knows it. You all know it. You're not going to be able to get across the Arctic. What are you going to do in Greenland if you invade? You better bring some strong ice cleats, because it's very difficult. So I've toiled with this question in my own mind. I would like to see a stronger defense. It's just part of my nature. But at the same time, do I really think that there's going to be conflict prosecuted in the North American Arctic? I don't think so. I think our role really is to defend the southern parts of Canada and the United States from missiles coming in. That's really our role.
So and so we talk a lot about NORAD modernization, and then so there's the DO line, but then there's just kind of more writ large about building up the North and in Canada. And so the way we talk about it a lot of times is, and it's come out in the new D&D defense policy update about talking about multi-user, multi-purpose infrastructure. And so, how do we just do well for the North altogether? So you've got to boost defense, but then also we need economic, infrastructure, transportation, energy, telecommunications. And we also need a lot of social infrastructure. And so how do you figure out how you can, multi-purpose a lot of these type of infrastructure builds? So, but just taking on what you're saying, because so there's got this weird kind of retreat thing going on by Trump in terms of like playing this kind of global player on the defense side. So would that mean then maybe like if it was a Harris, and then whoever in Canada kind of relationship between the US and Canada, that there would be more effort on cooperation and investments on modernizing NORAD and on the Arctic and, kind of building out like defense and other infrastructure, whether it's ports or what have you, then there is with
current NORAD modernization came through Biden-Harris, right? So you would think that especially the commitment by Canada to put more in came through Biden-Harris, not during the Trump era.
Right. And so if there's then there'll be less of a feeling of, the US saying, you guys got to get your acting gear. And then how does NATO play into that, I guess, right?
Yeah, well,
because you've got
that's
the other piece of that.
yeah,
in
that's the
terms of-
bigger part of it is the
Yeah.
whole NATO thing. And surprisingly, I thought all the Europeans were unhappy with the US with the amount of pressure that Trump was putting on them to invest. But with what's happened in Russia, a lot of those folks are saying it turns out it was the right thing to do because we all, no matter if the US is on your side or not, the idea of a major power invading your nation that has tanks lined up on your border, no matter if the US is your strong ally, it's going to take a while to get there, to deploy an adequate amount of forces to stop a land power that's next door. And so a number of people from the European countries have said, while they were unhappy that Trump was pounding his fist on the table, they're actually happy that happened because now they're putting some money into their own defense. It still has to be part of this broader network if you want to be effective, especially if you're a small state.
No, you're going to say
And
something.
may I just add to that? I think we're thinking about defense and security policy while we talk right now in a very, if you will, traditional manner. So one of the things that I am preoccupied with, not only when it comes to Greenland, but the Arctic as a whole, is the notion of cybersecurity threats.
Yeah.
Right. Because I agree with Craig that I don't think we'll see like an invasion. How would these soldiers actually behave within the Arctic environment? So I don't think that's a realistic scenario either.
They're going to shiver.
I do think that, right? The new threats in terms of cybersecurity threats, I think we should really look more into them. Just talking about the US election coming up and how outside forces may or may not have interfered with that will be a question for the smaller Arctic communities as well. So just to name an example,
kind of, right?
It's going to be a parliamentary election in Greenland probably in March or April of next year. So I'm super curious about, will we see an interference in that election? And I think regardless of whether it's going to be a she or a he president in the US, that will be a point of departure when it comes to talking about defense and security policy in the Arctic.
But then you get into kind of these more subtle, but just as important issue areas in terms of trade and investment. And so therefore, how does then that play into if you have a more isolationist view versus a more internationalist kind of view, but then is it easier or more difficult to address and deal with some of these other types of I don't know, in security and threat issue areas in terms of going back to a place that's underdeveloped in terms of infrastructure, in terms of a resource-rich region, and the need for a lot of investments in the region,
new
right?
types of investments.
Yeah.
And
another thing, regardless of whether it's going to be Harris or Trump in the White House after the election on Tuesday, I think the U.S. just appointed an Arctic ambassador.
Yep.
Right, and I think that's if you will, that's also a signal to the rest of the world that this is prioritized, but two, it's also prioritized in a manner that secures some sort of stability. So my vain hope is that we'll actually see a security of whether or not it's Harris or Trump becoming the president.
And there was a lot of talk with Lisa Murkowski also talking about how trying to get, Arctic policy in the U.S. to go through, to be congressionally approved and therefore doesn't have to go according to whoever's in office, which is a massive issue in Canada. And I think really undermines the ability for things to get done in the North, because it just becomes a political football, basically. Or a hockey puck, maybe, or hockey, if we want to talk Canadian, right?
Football.
The
Global.
Right.
there we go. Yeah, in terms of, because you need to have long-term visions for these, for anything going on in the Arctic, and you can't have a long-term vision with a strategic plan how to get there if you have to deal in terms of every time there's a new election, and people like then just to throw everything out because the other people did it, that type of thing.
Yeah, that's one of the worst things, is when the new guy comes in, they throw everything out, even the good stuff. It's kind of a bad way to do business.
Yeah.
I think the way to go forward, though, on what you were talking about, Jessica, is not necessarily to have Arctic policy. You can have policy, but it has to be related to a law, right? And so there isn't really an Arctic law.
Yeah.
And so if we had an Arctic law that the Congress would dictate, and then the president would need to carry it out, the problem then, of course, is we get into growing the government even bigger, and it's this amorphous blob as it is that nobody can really figure out, and creating something new inside of it makes it tough.
Yep. Last thing I'll say on that, but then what it does, though, also is it creates budgets. It creates consistency. It creates
that part I completely agree with.
You can plan, and so you are able, and that gives a signal to then folks who want to maybe possibly invest, because it's not going to be here today, gone tomorrow. There's some sort of longer term stability going on. I guess on that, well, Jaiden, quickly, up in Norman Wells, are folks talking about the elections? What are they saying? What's happening? Do they feel like it's going to impact where you are?
Not too much. Like, even I feel like politics isn't a big thing people talk about at the community level, especially in national politics. So yeah, not too much talk about it here.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see. So yeah, I think I guess on the US elections coming up, all we can do is wait until after Tuesday. Hope.
Well, maybe that's what we do, Jessica. Maybe we write an open letter to the new president, whoever it's going to be, and give them some good ideas for continuing a good strategy going forward.
Strengthening cooperation, finding ways to have long-term, invested cooperation, and building out. Because I think in a lot of this, whether it's defense or social or economic, the infrastructure is the key, and it should be, and how do we
infrastructure and energy costs, I think,
and energy and telecommunications.
Those are the
and
two big things for the Arctic.
And how do we then create new linkages that are North American Arctic? Because you guys talk about your one port, and we talk about having some port, but how do we figure out then how to make these good for the whole region, right? And everyone who lives there. Okay. All right. Well, let's pick it up then.
Thank you, everybody.
Same time, same place.
Thank you.
You guys are awesome.
All right.
It's a lot of fun.
We're out of here. Good.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with others interested in the North. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on an update from around the Arctic. Thank you for listening. Stay warm, and we'll see you next time.